There we go. Right. So today we're going to be talking about some Linux distributions, right? Because if you've ever gone into Linux, you've probably seen a lot of distributions, but maybe only tried like Ubuntu or Fedora or the couple big ones. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the differences between the different Linux distributions, the advantages one would have, or stuff like that, basically, right? So I'm going to start by trying to define what Linux is. It's not going to be long, but we need to put down some basic, let's say, stonework here. So at the bottom of it, when you talk about Linux, you're basically talking about the kernel, right? The Linux kernel, built by this beautiful specimen of a man here, Linus Torvalds. And the, let's say, basic features of the Linux kernel is that everything is a file in Linux, right? So your printer, your hard drives, your partitions, your regular files, everything is a file, right? Also, the Linux kernel is defined as being monolithic. That meaning that the whole operating system is running into the so-called kernel space. Now, the kernel space, not going to go deep in this, it's basically a virtual part of the memory which is allocated specifically for the kernel, so the user has no access to that part of the memory, right? And also it is modular in the sense that you can install certain parts of the kernel and refuse to install other parts and it's still going to work, right? But what most people refer to when they're talking about Linux is basically GNU, actually. And GNU is an acronym, a recursive acronym, might I say, meaning GNU is not Linux, is not Unix, right? And it was built by this gentleman right here, Richard Stallman. It's a free operating system which is using the Linux kernel. And it has a lot of kids and grandkids, shall I say, meaning that a lot, and I mean a lot of distributions are based on, So we're gonna be talking a little bit about what differentiates the different Linux distributions, right? And the short answer is a lot. I mean, your distributions might be differentiated by the bootloader they use, the init system they use, the package manager, whether they use a window manager or a desktop environment, what desktop environment or window manager they're using, and so on, right? So we're going to be talking about bootloaders first. And what it does, it's booting the system, right? And you've got a bunch of variants of bootloaders that are used in the different Linux distributions. The most, shall I say, famous one is Grub. Ubuntu runs on that, Fedora runs on that, most Linux distributions run on that. There's also Lilo, which at a certain point was used by Debian, but it was then discontinued. And one trend you are going to see with all the Linux distributions is that we're actually going towards some form of standardization, meaning that the different distributions started up very, very different, but during their development, they are starting to move towards more standard forms so that it becomes easier to work, between distributions. So it won't be a problem anymore if I have Ubuntu, someone else has Fedora, or so on, right? Also, you've got two more outliers, should I say, Borg and SysLinux. Now, I haven't tried any one of these bootloaders except for Grub, but from what I can tell, you can basically install mostly whatever you want as a bootloader, but most distributions are going to be coming preloaded with Grub, right? Now, another thing that might be different between distributions is the init systems, right? And what I mean by battle for systemd, systemd is basically the system daemon, and it's the first process that starts after you booted your operating system. And in the Linux community, there's a very, very big battle whether systemd is actually worth it or not. And before going over the variants, I'm going to talk about this little controversy a little. Basically, systemd does a lot of stuff, right? It's not only a init system, it also comes up with a lot of other daemons. Like, for example, you might see login so the login daemon, and a lot of other stuff. And what they're trying to do is, once again, as I was saying earlier, standardize the way Linux distributions work. And you're going to be finding a lot of hipsters saying that, oh, you don't need systemd since you can use a different init system that isn't so bloated and whatnot. Though, in my opinion, if you want to have custom stuff, just use a distribution that has custom stuff, right? So don't start bitching about, oh, Ubuntu is bloated because it uses systemd, or Arch Linux is bloated because it uses systemd, and so on, right? All right. So the variants of init systems that I've come across. The first one is systemv, that actually has nothing to do with systemd. I know, fuck it. This is a rather old init system. Almost every single Linux distribution used to use this before systemd came along. But since it's the, let's say, father of all the init systems that are coming around, you might see parts of it incorporated within other init systems, right? Systemd I've already talked about. Everyone uses it nowadays, mostly, except for some hipster distributions. For example, there's a distribution called Artix, which is based on Arch Linux, but the only difference is that they don't use systemd, because some people just don't want progress, shall I say. Right. Also, Upstart. I've read that Ubuntu uses this in combination, so it's basically a combination between systemv and systemd. Though since I'm not using Ubuntu nowadays, I haven't been able to, look into it that much and try it out myself. From what I can tell, there's no, shall I say, noticeable difference between its usage and the usage of systemd, since already Upstart is something related to systemd, right? OpenRC is another one. It's used by BSD-based distros. I haven't used any BSD distros, so I can't really say if it's good or not. And there's also Runit. And I've seen a lot of people saying that it's really good and so on. And they're, very fond of it since it doesn't bring along too many other stuff and so on and so forth. But it didn't have any release since fucking 2014. So yeah, nice one. Right, so going forward, we're going to be talking about package managers a bit. Almost every single Linux distribution has its own package managers, except for derivatives. So any Linux distro that is based on Debian is going to be using the AFT package manager. So that's Ubuntu, that is Elementary OS, that is Kali Linux. So anything based on Debian, and Debian itself, of course. Arch Linux-based distros are going to be using Pacman. So that would be Arch Linux itself. That would be Manjaro Linux. That would be Garuda Linux. So once again, anything, and many, many others. From what I can tell, the main difference between package managers is basically style. So whether you like the way you use the commands or not, since most of the package managers that are present in the major distributions already have in their repositories most of the software you might need. So it basically comes down to preference here. And another main difference is desktop environments that you might see in Linux distributions. Now, this one is the one I've tinkered most with. I've tried a lot of desktop environments. And once again, since it's layout stuff, it comes down to preference, right? So you've got GNOME, which is the most used one, shall I say, though not in a monopoly sense, right? So it's not absolutely the most used one. But since Ubuntu uses GNOME by default, you're going to see a lot of Linux distributions running GNOME. There's also KDE, which is, shall I say, the most tinkering based Linux distributions, since you can change basically whatever you want. It's the most customizable out of all the different desktop environments, you might say. Budgie is an interesting one. It's based on an older version of GNOME, and it's pretty similar, though it comes with a more emphasis on customizability. You can customize GNOME as well, don't get me wrong, but you have to install different extensions and also install software like GNOME Tweaks or the conf editor to change stuff about GNOME. Budgie tries to make it a lot easier on the end user to change stuff related to their distribution and their desktop environment. There's also a rather new one called Deepin. Now, this came out from a Linux distribution called Deepin OS made by some Chinese guys. And I've tried a distro, and weirdly, it was sending some requests to a server in China, so I uninstalled it pretty quickly afterwards. Though the desktop environment itself is pretty neat. It's very heavily focused on the visuals. So you're going to see a lot of animations. You're going to see a lot of pretty glassy effects. It's kind of trying to imitate the Mac OS feel, though it is pretty, shall I say, easy to recognize on its own. And there are a lot of other ones. Mate, LXQt, Cinnamon, I haven't tried, though from what I can tell, they're basically variations of GNOME or KDE. But I've talked about the first 4 ones since I've used them myself. Now, I'm going to be talking about 3 Linux distributions that you might not have used that I found pretty neat whilst using them. So the first one is Solus OS. It's made by a community team based mainly in Ireland and New York. And these are the guys that actually created the Budgie desktop environment. And as I said, it's community driven, and it has its own package manager called EOPKG. It is kind of difficult to get used to it at the beginning, but you're gonna get it really, really quickly if you start using it. And there's a screenshot of what Solus OS looks like when you install it with the Budgie in its Budgie desktop environment. As you can see, it's kind of Windowsy in the way it looks like, all with the system tray and the whole footer. But I think I enjoyed it, honestly, though kind of didn't like some of the decisions that the guys made. Another one is Ubuntu DDE. So this is a variant of Ubuntu that actually uses the Deepin desktop environment I was talking about earlier, the pretty one. Because people, as I said, weren't okay with their Linux distros sending requests to China. So someone started saying, okay, I like the way this looks like, but I don't want the Chinese to, get my data. So they basically created a variant of Ubuntu that uses this environment. And it looks like this. So as you can see, it's very, very, sugary. It's very visual based. And as you can imagine, this is actually pretty, heavy on the resources. I haven't experienced, lags and stuff, though I didn't enjoy the shortcuts they were using for changing, desktop, virtual desktops and stuff like that. And this is the main reason I installed it. And again, it's pretty heavy on your resources. But if you just want a Linux that is pretty, you might just as well go ahead with this one. And another one is Ferret OS. And this is a distribution that is the main competitor of Kali Linux, though it's not so heavily oriented towards, hacking and penetration testing and stuff like that, though there is a version that has all the tools installed. This is mainly a distribution focused on programming and security. And it is very lightweight compared to Kali Linux, because as I said, you can change whether you come with all those pen testing tools and so on, whilst with Kali you cannot. So if you install Kali Linux, you're gonna have all those tools. And this is Debian based, so you're gonna be using Aperture package manager. And it looks like this with the KDE display environment. So that will be it for my presentation. If you've got any questions, that would be the time. Yeah.